saw a ghost inside our house, or was it wishful thinking? Please send us a miracle so I know that there is meaning. You said I think that it's a miracle just to be breathing, so live on, baby, live on. So, we have one book about a duck, and one book about a bear, and one book now about a ghost, but all of them are about the dark and sad heart of the twisted animal that is man. Matt Hongoltz-Hetling, welcome back to the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast. Excited to get
Joel,
into your next book.
Thank
Matt
you
is the
very
last
much.
journalist working in America. How does it feel? Tell us about the before times.
I left the field long ago. Yeah, I'm not holding that bag.
Well, we really enjoyed Ghost Lab, which is that on sale now? When does it come out?
It comes out on May 20th. And
Okay.
thank you so much. You're actually one of only a handful of people who have read it, Joel. I bet you not. 40 people in the world have gotten their hands on an advanced copy. So I'm so gratified that you received one and took the time to read it, and have been kind enough to give me some good feedback on it. So I really appreciate that.
I think you do a great job, and I'm hoping that we can have a conversation about kind of like your subject selection and thought process. You have a nuanced relationship to the subjects that's inherently kind of I don't want to say critical, but respectful, and also inquiring. That sits with a lot of stuff, but also, you talk about your relationship to the subjects, that they like the book, and then maybe a kind of a broader look at some of the things you suggest at the end that would improve our relationship to healthcare and institutions at a time where I think institutional credibility is really much on the decline in a way that, whoever's fault it is, it's still kind of a damaging thing. That's not good. And you propose some interesting solutions and kind of sit with a lot of nuance there. So if we could start with that and kind of go through that, that'd be great.
Thank you very much for noting that. And yeah, it was sort of like a weird headspace for me to get into, because I am sort of personally like a skeptic. I'm one of these, and I know you've written some really fascinating stuff about sort of like getting too married to quantifiable outcomes, right?
Which
And
doesn't
that's
mean
me.
it's not important. It's just, and I think that's two conversations too. Because I mean, part of what my criticism is, like, there's some things that should just be self-evident in medicine that we should just let be self-evident and not pretend like, oh, well, we need to research it because it threatens the profit motive. No, like we know this stuff's real. Kind of go on and move on. And then secondly, I think psychology, which is, I'm doing therapy, doesn't behave the same as cancer research in a way that we kind of pretend that it needs to. And a lot of your like objective, you looking at that stuff it was really fascinating. And like, you've got the three books: A Libertarian Walks into a Bear, If It Walks Like a Quack, and also the Ghost Lab now. And in all of them, you select a subject that is kind of like a microcosm for a bigger thing, but you don't opine a ton. I mean, the focus of it is investigative journalism, and like, you're looking at these people who we don't know, but we feel like we know because they're relevant to a larger conversation that you're trying to talk about. So could you talk about the process of kind of like subject selection and, what put you in that headspace?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I kind of started off wanting to write about the lack of trust that is sort of like blooming in America, right? And you can say, oh yeah, well, that's because government sucks. And that's why there's declining trust in government. But then there's also decline in hospitals. Okay, well, our healthcare system sucks. Okay, health and trust in science is also declining. Well, that's because science. At some point you start to say, like, are there something that's sort of tilting the playing field, right, against trust?
Mm-hmm.
And people are trusting their neighbors less. People are trusting their churches less.
Mm-hmm.
People are just trusting everything less than they did as recently as 20 years ago, dramatically less.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sort of like looking at all this stuff and sort of casting about for reasons why this might be so. And what I found was that the trust in institutions, the ebb in that trust could be measured in people who were sort of opting out of some of these societal institutional systems that we've had in place for so long, right?
Yeah.
And to speak a little bit to your field, there's a segment of people who are saying, I can't trust the branch of psychology. I also
Yeah.
can't trust therapy.
Yeah.
My worldview is puts me in a place where that is all sus, right? And so they are turning to sort of other avenues. So I was like, okay, well, who's sort of inheriting that trust that institutions are losing? And what I found is that people are taking their problems of various sorts that used to be solved by institutions, or at least in the sort of like the golden age of institutions, the last 80 years or so, and instead are putting their trust in the paranormal believer community, right? So they are so as soon as I kind of like cotton to the paranormal thing, that folks are seeking services from alien abduction support groups, peer groups, that people are seeking support from their mediums and psychics.
Yeah.
People are looking for explanations for their feelings of unease
Hmm.
from ghost hunters and so on, and they're looking for their answers in these other places.
Hmm.
Um, and so then I really wanted to find a sort of representative group of these sorts of, industry is probably too strong a word, but these sorts of communities and belief systems. And I landed on a really interesting, small, colorful group of folks in New Hampshire's Seacoast region, who among them, count that there were, 5 or 6 principal players, and they were like, there was a ghost hunter, there was an alien abductee who was also a Bigfoot hunter, there was an
Hmm.
empath, there was a psychic medium, and so on. And so they just really reflected sort of like the spectrum of beliefs that are united under the broader umbrella of paranormal beliefs.
Yeah.
And so I spent a couple of years, talking to these folks. And when I said earlier that it put me into a weird headspace, I'm the numbers guy, right? I am.
Yeah.
My wife sent me a video yesterday that said this makes me sad, and the video was of kids running like a school shooting drill in
Yeah.
school, right?
My wife's a
And
teacher, so, I'm a social worker married to a teacher, so we're very much, like, in the world of watching the decline of these institutions that are, public institutions. When you privatize them, I don't know what our role is or what our thing is, and, when you look at, the effects that the decline of this stuff, has. I mean, my wife had, like, when she was trained, the cops go through and they shoot like huge assault rifles and show you the noise and all
yeah,
this stuff. And it's like that's a school training is horrifying.
yeah, and I think when my wife said that to me, I thought like, is this really necessary? Because clearly this has some downsides. And so then, so for me, for my math brain, I'm like, okay, what's the quantifiable risk? Like what are the odds that a child will be killed in a school shooting?
Yeah.
It's like 1 in a million.
Yeah.
And when I'm thinking about safety for my own children, my ears really start to perk up around the 1 in 10,000 mark, right? Like risks
Yeah.
that are significantly greater than 1 in 10,000, I am very attuned to. But if I find
Mhm.
that a risk is much less than 1 in 10,000, if it's 1 in 100,000, I start to think like, possibly the barriers that we put up to protect that child from that risk are themselves creating more harm than they are worth.
I'm thinking
Um,
of like during a lot of the like Bush years terrorism scare, they would compare your risk of dying of a heart attack with like your risk of being killed by a terrorist or something. And people are like eating the baconator and then being like, please protect me from Al Qaeda. And I'm more of kind of a like, what is the most likely outcome? Not how do I keep my emotions out of this and look at like what is actually likely to be the threat to public health. And I don't know that it is 9/11. Um,
yeah, I agree entirely. Like we've changed a lot of a lot of systems, right? In response to 9/11, and it's not at all clear that those systems truly keep us safe. And it seems like there are many other, disadvantageous aspects to those changes. It's a very sort of like reactionary position that we would never build from the ground up if we were building our society from scratch.
Yeah, when you're inherently reactionary and you can never really have a vision of the future, which I think is where we are now. You don't. There's no plan for where you end up. Like everything is like, yeah, well, I mean, we're kind of here because this happened 10 years ago, and then we did that, and it's like, yeah, but why are we doing all of this together? Like, why? Can we have like a? Can we admit the things that don't work? And
Right.
I think like a lot of your book is pretty bipartisan in the issues it talks about. Liberals are more likely to cling to institutions.
Hmm.
But I mean, I think some of these institutions have lost credibility for a reason that has to be solved if you want credibility to come back. And the kind of blind faith thing of vote blue no matter who or whatever, when you're not really being offered a solution, is just not an answer, any more than the kind of right wing reactionary grievance stuff, that it changes the enemy changes every 2 years. And a lot of what you talk about is like it contains the respectful seed of like a greater vision, for society, which is, it's a book about a ghost lab. It's a book about paranormal researchers. I mean, even like when I'm getting to like you talking about the flock of dodo stuff with the threat to science that was predicted, decades back, when
Hmm.
the people kind of saw this stuff, yeah, I'm like really admiring how all of these threads come together and like where you go, because it doesn't jump topics, but it pretty naturally just contains a lot of creativity and insight.
I'm really grateful to hear you say that, and to hear that some of those aspects are landing with at least one reader. Now, if I can just scale that up, I'll be a very happy man. Um, and yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. Political partisanship sort of like drives people into forms of dogma or dogmatic expressions that are really unhelpful, right?
Yeah.
And and when I was approaching the book in the paranormal, I was, a diehard skeptic. As I said, I'm a numbers guy, and I want this. If the guys in the white coats don't say it's true, I am, very, very leery to say that's true. And I sort of like went in with this attitude that all of this stuff is BS, right?
Yeah.
But I also sort of knew that I had to respect the worldview of the folks that I was speaking to because, as I told them early in the process, like, you're not criminals, you're not politicians who are being held up for transparency and public inspection. You are someone with what to me amounts to like sort of an interesting hobby or pastime. And so the fact that they were willing to speak with me, reflected a certain amount of trust on their part, and I really wanted to sort of like honor that. And that sort of led me into building relationships with these people and their worldviews that really made me sort of appreciate that while I remain skeptical, uh, I don't necessarily think that shifts to what I call in the book a post-institutional world have to be bad outcomes. We can have weaker institutions. Psychics can provide some of these services, but you know, we have to build a bridge to get there if that's where we're deciding to go. We can't debunk ghosts out of existence.
Well,
They
it's a belief
tickle.
that goes back to the Bronze Age. I don't know that you're going to get rid of
Yeah,
religion in that way. I think you have to reconcile with it. I'm a Jungian leaning
absolutely.
therapist, and I think the transcendent function is pretty inherent in how we make meaning and that we kind of create a cosmology. It maybe is healthier to engage with that in a symbolic or a metaphorical way, but I don't know that everyone always will. And if a patient came into therapy or to the doctor and they were a religion that the provider is not, you wouldn't just discount everything and try. I mean, it's built into the code of ethics now that you have to take, these religious beliefs seriously. That doesn't mean that you have to take them literally or you have to recommend behavior that's destructive. I mean, you point out where that isn't helpful or where there's an abusive power structure that somebody's participating in. But just because they believe in a god or gods that I don't, or a way of relating to that or definition of any of that stuff. I mean, to me, it's like, why fight about these things anyway? I don't. People have a metaphorical and a symbolic sense of reality that science and healthcare have to make room for in order to treat people, because we don't treat them in a lab, we don't treat them in a research study, we treat them in life.
Yeah, I bumped into a therapist just yesterday, sort of like on the playground. Our kids were playing together, and I started sort of like talking to her and asking her about these things when I found out what her field was. And she said, "Oh yes, and in our office, in our practice, which is focused on sort of like substance abuse and addiction issues, um, we really uh, are mindful not to challenge these delusions." And so like I walked away from the conversation thinking like, oh, isn't that great? She's not challenging the delusions. But then, I think really where I've ultimately landed through the course of writing this book is that um, to even think of them as delusions
Mhm.
is sort of like pejorative, right?
Yeah.
It's it's a sort of patronizing position
Yeah.
that I think a lot of patients are going to smell and sort of like get away from. And you talked about the need to respect other religions, and I think that's absolutely true. The folks that I focus on in the book are sort of like the 22% of Americans who are spiritual but not religious is
Mhm.
how they categorize. They think there's something there, but they don't think church has the answers, and they are a lot of times those expressions are hey, I think that I've been abducted by an alien. And a therapist does not have the same training necessarily to sort of like get into that headspace in a way. It can't necessarily speak in a language that the purported alien abductee um, will respect and understand and feel heard in.
Yeah. Well, and I started my career working with some of the worst cases of schizophrenia, comorbid with other illnesses in the state. And a lot of those patients, well, I mean, one, antipsychotics don't treat delusion, they treat hallucinations. So the hallucinations can stop. But that doesn't mean that the belief goes away. A lot of times the delusion stays. And when you do that, I mean, the least effective social workers that I saw went in and were like, this isn't true. This can't be true. Here's all the reasons. And coming from this place of hostility that is debate club. Like it's completely ineffective. I think therapeutically or politically, just getting lost in a debate about logic is the worst thing you can do. You follow emotion. I mean, same thing I do now. And the way that I was affected with people was, I'm not talking about the dragon that lives in your basement. I'm going to say, oh my God, you must be so scared. And, I can see that your back is tired. I can see that, you haven't eaten and you're just dealing with a lot of stress. And all of a sudden we're on the same page and we're talking about the dragon because the dragon is a metaphor for the sexual abuse that I experienced or whatever, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not gonna have insight, into this maybe in the way that I'm not gonna have insight into this the way that you or I would, but I'm still treating this with respect, and it also has a symbolic truth, even though I don't believe that there literally is a dragon in their basement. I had somebody one time a long time ago, and it was, pretty classic paranoid schizophrenia before I ever, this is when I first started my career, and it was like, you used to say that you were getting this information from books or from these online communities or you're getting it on the internet. But now you are in your house and you have all the aluminum foil and the traps for the government and all this stuff. And there's no access to information. Like you don't have internet anymore. You don't have books. You don't leave. So how are you figuring out what the government is doing with these lasers and satellites to put the words in your head? And he said, that's a good question. You get the feeling that you have when you're wondering if something's true, but then you just know that it is, which is a really amazing description of a delusion. Because the ability to reality
Absolutely.
test with a dopamine disorder like that, it's just not there, and fighting about that deficit is just kind of pointless. And you probably get somewhere interesting. I mean, you do get somewhere interesting with these people. Could you tell us? I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but could you tell us about the major characters, how you met them,
Oh yeah.
kind of how they present, and then the ultimate disagreements, that they have, or the differing
Yeah.
positions that they had within their own community?
Yeah. The book sort of like nicely sort of locked into this really fascinating sort of central narrative where you had a guy named Andy Kitt who is very much he's a ghost hunter. He was motivated to sort of like enter the field of ghost hunting from a strong personal experience that he had in the wake of his father's death, where he
It was
believed
just
he
kind
was
of a
moved from
coming to
his
terms with grief almost. It
yeah
felt like
coming
a
to
grieving
yeah.
part of grieving.
Absolutely. And and he and his whole family sort of like experienced this, had a set of experiences that they believed were indicative of their father speaking from beyond the grave. And Andy got into ghost hunting, and he's by nature sort of like a combative, conservative, a crank, for lack of a better word. He wants proof for things, and he is, sort of like happy to offend, and will not, brook nonsense, right? And so he sort of like took this attitude into ghost hunting, and essentially uh felt like most of the ghost hunters were jokes, and most of the psychics were jokes, and so
It's the made for
he said, I'm going
TV
to start
thing,
my
that
own group.
reality TV that, it gives
Yeah,
everybody a bad name.
yeah. He called them fluffy donuts, which was a term he seemed very comfortable with. I'd never heard it before I spoke to him. But it's evocative. So he sort of like assembled this team that included Bo Esby, who was a psychic whose sort of like ability to communicate with spirits, and at times foretell the future. Andy really found to be authentic and resonated with him. And they sort of picked up this guy, Mike Stevens, who was the alien abductee who made contact with them while trying to get petitions to honor a famous alien abduction site in the state of New Hampshire. He wanted recognition from the state, sort of like a state monument or historical marker there. And Mike is, a very like sort of traumatized guy by his alien abduction experiences, which have plagued him, since childhood. And then they picked up, a couple of other central characters along the way. Val Lofaso, who is a psychic slash aspiring fiction writer, or I should say published fiction writer. And Anja Bordages, who she's sort of like this hyper organized organizational force. She's a psychic, but she sort of like primarily identifies with her job as a legal assistant, and so she's all about the paperwork and managing risk and that sort of stuff. And so they sort of like come together under this sort of noble shared dream of, we're going to bring science to these fields, and we're going
Mhm.
to sort out the wheat from the chaff, and we're going to
And they
tell
had
the
systems of getting objective data that were in place.
yeah
They wanted to
yeah
make it not just, "Well, I saw this and wrote it down," but actually get quantified data of the supernatural, essentially.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Andy, him, in particular, was very sort of like dedicated and well versed in, what constitutes a blind study, and those sorts of things. So Andy was the one who could sort of spearhead drafting protocols that would sort of like maintain some integrity of their investigations and results. Um, and so then over the course of about 9 years, they set about trying really hard to document science and to sort of like maintain their integrity in this field, and um sort of try to establish a brand that would mean something within this very sort of like squishy, topsy-turvy landscape of paranormal beliefs. And then, uh over the course of time, they find that within their group, some of their members prioritize the hard search for evidence, which is sort of like the institutional view of ghost hunting. Like,
Mhm.
let's prove it. Let's get those numbers.
Mhm.
Let's find that evidence that suggests that we all live in a shared reality, even though that shared reality may be far different from what we have put into mainstream science. And that priority sort of butted heads against another priority of, let's be inclusive. Let's accept everyone's word at face value, and let's sort of like honor those individual experiences, even if they don't seem to be uh uh true or compatible with other beliefs that we've also sanctioned, instead are to be honored.
Mhm.
And that is sort of like the fight that's going on in the paranormal community. That's a diversity of thought
There's
that
some
really
people
has
who
impact
feel
for the
like,
rest
just
of
to
us.
clarify for the audience, like there's some people who feel like you can just sort of subjectively contact the uh, something and receive a subjective download of information, and that's enough. And then there are other people who want to have, objective proof that those things are real or some way of validating them in order to maintain that through science, the study of that through
Exactly
science
right.
instead of personal
So
experience.
someone gets up at the UFO support group and says, I was abducted by an alien who looked like Mel Gibson in my, bedroom, whatever sort of like outlandish tale that you might come up with, and they would think, oh, geez, okay, so that guy is off base. What he is saying did not objectively happen. Um, but so do you drum that guy out of the group and say, this is not consistent with our search for evidence, or
Mhm.
do you say, oh, this guy's had an experience, and sort of like that more therapeutic approach that you were talking about, Joel.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, yeah. So, you have a couple people in the book that are the main characters, and then ultimately they kind of have conflict, and the ghost lab doesn't continue in the way that it is kind of set up in the beginning. Could you talk about that process and maybe its relationship to broader, institutions?
yeah. So it's you're right. These sort of like competing priorities of, do we honor the individual experience versus do we prioritize the search for agreed upon evidence? Those tensions sort of started to manifest in some pretty sharp personality differences, where some people were very intent on being nice, and other people were very intent on being correct, right? And over the course of time, uh, that led to all sorts of problems. And within the group, they had sort of like spiritual and supernatural explanations for a lot of the problems that happened.
Yeah.
Andy in particular, one of the ways that this organization hoped to make money was by establishing a retail center where they could sell, their books and whatever supernatural, ghost hunting gear and that sort of thing. Um, and Andy was sort of like renovating a space, and Andy had some carpentry skills, and he's like like building a counter and all that. He wound up renovating the space for like 2 years and not really making significant progress. But it was also like the only thing that he was giving his attention to. So the
Mhm.
whole organization is sort of like suffering for his lack of attention. He is focused on the retail space, and at some point while he's building it, he realizes that when he's done, they will not be able to sell some out of it because they don't have the money to sort of like buy inventory and stock the shelves and staff it. And so he's in this really sort of like odd place where he's just building and building and building, and not getting anywhere. And they eventually sort of conclude that he is being victimized by a spiritual non-human entity, like an emotional parasite that is sort of creating this conflict within him and feeding off of it. And yeah, so eventually those sort of broader tensions uh, um started to have the group fighting among themselves. That this idea of objectivity versus individual experience, I think, is sort of like the disagreement that core at the group, and it's also the disagreement that really has some implications for society. Because if the science guys within the paranormal community win, if they are really dedicated to searching for evidence, they can work within the confines and contexts of institutions that honor science. Like they have to get funding for some outlandish ideas, but they can devise watertight experience and sort of like eventually, in their worldview, prove that ghosts are real, or that certain psychic effects are real. Um,
Freud and Jung
the
had that same fight, which I think in A Dangerous Method he glamorizes it, but it's the exact same. The dialogue is the same that they both recount happens. Where Freud
That's
says this
so
is about
interesting.
credibility. You can't go in this place, and Jung is like, I haven't ruled out that it's paranormal yet. I don't know if it's psychological or paranormal. I'm not gonna. I'm not. I want to And Freud is like, no, I'm the scientist because I won't consider that. And Jung is like, well, I'm the scientist because I will. And then I think, you follow Jung, he does kind of rule out most of the broad strokes of the paranormal stuff, and he starts to see it more as a kind of the brainstem and a depth, psychology connection to the older self. He doesn't really rule that out, and there's a lot of cranks now in the Jungian world, and then grifters that borrow from that. But it's an old fight.
Yeah, and Joe, you know so much about the sort of like history of psychology, and one of my sort of like takes from the book is that we might be seeing sort of like the development of a new professional class within the paranormal sort of like worldview that parallels the original development of psychology. Yeah, like it started off in a weird place, right?
Mhm.
Early psychologists, there was no clear definition of what that was, and
Well, and then technology
that
makes us reconsider those assumptions again. I mean, in the 70s, you have,
yeah,
which I'd like to talk at the end about how I think a lot of where we are now is the same place we were in the 70s, where people are just considering all this wild stuff. And technology's kind of changed our metaphor that helps us understand ourselves, because that's always kind of, understand ourselves through the technology of the time. So it's like a watch is invented and people are like, maybe God is a watchmaker. Building is invented earlier and they're like, maybe God is an architect. And then, now they're like, maybe God is an LLM, or whatever. But like, in the 70s, there's all this new stuff. I mean, there's that Jungian current. But I mean, the CIA basically, with like John C. Lilly and the Monroe Institute and people like that, they were like, we don't know that identical twins can't send pictures in each other's minds from the other room. Maybe that would be helpful to
right.
fight Russia. Here's $1 million. We don't know that you can't kill a goat by thinking really hard about it, or burst clouds like Wilhelm Reich. John C. Lilly, here's $1 million, build a facility and feed LSD to dolphins. Maybe you can teach them to talk. Maybe the reason dolphins don't talk is just no one fed them LSD and tried to yet. They really did those experiments
Absolutely.
because they didn't know.
Yes.
And I mean, that was rolled out. It turns out that didn't work, but no one knew that,
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, like and science, yeah, they have like continued to sort of like take it up. And there's a researcher in Arizona who sort of like built a lab that is still looking for sort of like some of these effects. Um, and I think that's sort of good. Like the public has like a great interest in the paranormal, right? And for science to just sort of have retreated into a corner of skepticism, as justified as that may be, um, shows sort of like such a break and a disconnect from where the public space is. And scientists, I think they used to sort of like be able to coast on correctness, right? It
Mhm.
used to be that a scientist, all they had to be was right. And I don't think that's the world we live in anymore. I think they need to sort of like uh, they have to worry about a trust with the public.
I think they should
And
have a
yeah,
perspective, and not the right answer, maybe, because science is always looking for the next right answer. It should be sort of a mode of being that makes sure that people don't get hurt. Like, and we can talk about some of your
mhm,
conclusions at the end. I'd like to stay with the characters for a minute, but I mean, I'm struck by like how much the evidence-based practice, because I mean, I write about that all the time, but like you're saying the same thing in the book. I'm assuming you're not reading my writing, and there's like this idea of evidence-based practice making something true or false, that I think there need to be more layers than that. Like, if you're a medical
mhm,
provider and you say, hey, you've got stage 4 cancer, but we're not going to do chemo, we're not going to do surgery. I want you to do Reiki. I want you to do crystals. I want you to do, prayer circles. I think that you shouldn't have a medical license. I mean, like, I don't think you should have one, but Reiki
right.
is evidence-based to make outcomes better. The Catholic Church had this huge
Mhm,
discussion because they're like, you're doing Reiki in the hospitals and you're doing it because it's an evidence-based practice. Like, we've shown that this makes outcomes better. There's some research like that about prayer. It's not really as strong, but that prayer circles make outcomes more. And if that's true that it does, who cares why, right? So I think like the actual mechanism of healing, like the primary thing, like yeah, you have to do chemotherapy. You have to tell people the outcome if they don't get chemotherapy or surgery. But
right.
if we know that like a diet that is low in sugar makes cancer tumors grow less, and that's a supplemental thing, like that shouldn't come first. You don't want to be the characters in your last book that are treating cancer with baking soda. But if that
Right.
helps, Why are we not telling every cancer patient that? If someone
Yeah,
says, I want Reiki, and we know that once you do chemo, Reiki helps you feel better, why is that not allowed? Even if and I think there's a fighting about, we want science to work on our own terms, that liberals are very, it's, that I fucking love science movement and stuff. A lot of those
yeah, yeah.
people, when you show actual science to them, they get angry because they want it to be like what they understand it to be, and not what the evidence says. I mean, that isn't the scientific method either. I don't know if that makes sense.
Correct.
Maybe understanding things that, are the primary cause and effect that we understand, and then the one where the cause and effect is a little bit more murky, but the outcome is there and it's researched and the randomized control trial proved it. So who are you to say that this isn't allowed? You know?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Yeah, we do all sort of like adopt a shorthand understanding because we're not experts, right? Most of us are sort of looking to signs other than the actual research to understand what the scientific consensus is, right? And um, those markers of scientific consensus are themselves, flawed and fuzzy. But then if you try to go the other way and actually read the research and wrap your head around it, you're much more likely to uh, chase your own, reinforce your own incorrect beliefs than you are to actually get to the heart of the matter. But because it's so difficult to sort of like weigh opposing viewpoints within the field properly.
Well, it's like you talk about Mesmer in the book, who is the origin of
Yeah,
hypnosis, or as it was called then, mesmerism, who it's Ben
yeah,
Franklin that ends up getting him debunked and thrown out. And Mesmer thought that hypnosis worked because of something called animal magnetism. That is wrong, right? But
correct.
the outcome was working. Like, he got the mechanism incorrect, but there's a ton of
Yeah,
medical hypnosis now that is evidence based. And so I think if you don't allow it to be like, it works, but we don't know why, for a
yeah, right.
minute,
It's a
how are you
question
going
of
to do
like,
research? How are you going to know?
yeah, it's a question of like practicality versus sort of like certainty, right?
Mhm.
And you're saying, and I agree, um, if there is a practical benefit to be had from doing something, then by all means let's do it. And if you don't understand why that's working, um, you know, continue to study. We don't understand why Ozempic works fully, right? We
The
just know that it
Nasonex
makes
ad, the
people
Antonio the
lose.
Antonio Banderas bee voice at the very end, after, what I'm talking about, the Nasonex one, or it's
Oh
like,
yeah.
yeah, at the very end, like, one of the things in the flavor text is like, "We do not know exactly why Nasonex works."
Ah,
That's one of the things in there. Uh,
yeah, yeah. And so like, yeah, like if we can sort of like, accept that when it's something that's sort of like centrally located within the dominant paradigm, why can't we offer the same sort of like tacit support to something that is coming from a more left field place?
well, I think you're always working with metaphors anyway, whether or not you want to be, and it doesn't really matter how
Mhm.
literally you take them. I mean, like, when you look at the amount of people that are religious or something that are using that to make meaning out of life, or, I mean, even science, like, look at how science functions when you go to eighth grade and they tell you, well, if there's two electrons on the shell on the outside and there's two protons in the middle, then the atom's happy. Well, not only is the atom, like, not actually happy, that's wrong. Like, that's the way you teach science to an eighth grader, because you can't sell, hey, there's particles popping in and out of existence, we think, and there's subshells and there's like 50 shapes, and like these are the more efficient and they want to be in this subshell, but like they titrate down if
Yeah,
you play like the little circle. All the things that you learn about actual science aren't real either. They're metaphors and symbols to understand a greater reality that is too overwhelming to help you make sense and start to, you know I don't know if that
yeah,
directly applies, but it's like we're always kind of working with these things that help us understand a reality that is more complex than we can understand anyway. And I think the
yeah. Didn't
discomfort with that makes us rely on certainty. And in my mind, the opposite of truth is not lies; it's certainty. You know,
mm,
it's the zealot that doesn't that thinks that they have figured out the perfect way to be, and they're not willing to modify that.
yeah, that's really interesting. And didn't you write at one point that sort of like physicists are much less beholden to quantifiable results. Yeah, that for them it's almost more like an art than
Yeah, Kukule, the guy who invented the benzene ring, which I mean, I guess later
yeah.
leads to World War II because our automotive companies give Hitler the ability to turn charcoal into diesel fuel, which he couldn't have done. It's an oilless country. He couldn't have he couldn't have done World War II if thank you Henry Ford. But yeah, the guy who invented the benzene ring, Kukule, he saw the serpent in a dream, and the Ouroboros turned into a figure eight, and um, a lot of those people were relying Einstein. There's a million quotes out there, but a lot of
Yeah.
those physicists, especially the ones around nuclear engineering, I mean, they all said this just came from an intuition of I saw this in my mind and I understood how it worked, and then I had to make the math
Hmm.
line up. And some of them didn't like math at all, which um,
Yeah.
Oppenheimer and Einstein were famous for, like, this is the last thing that you do is try and figure out the objective proof. We already know it works this way, just because I think there's a
Yeah.
certain way of seeing that people that are creative have that is intuition. Where it gets murky is our intuition feels like our trauma, and trauma feels like intuition. They masquerade. A lot of cult leaders, a lot of religious, abusive religious figures are incredibly intuitive
Hmm.
people, but they're sort of putting a trauma in the place of the self, or vice versa. And I don't want to ask you to play therapist too much, but when you look at the people who are in this book, can you see places where they're mistaking their own emotional needs for an objective truth, or they're trying to? Are
Yeah,
you
there's one scene that I recount in particular in the book that comes to mind where there are three women who are all, some level of psychic or some level of medium, and they are in a haunted sort of like former factory setting, and they're going through individually trying to like come up with individual impressions um that they can confirm with one another, and thereby, sort of like have an objective truth. And they're not doing a very good job of sealing their impressions off from one another, so they sort of like are leading each other into certain conclusions. But what they experience in that factory is the ghost of sort of like an abusive rapist, right?
Yeah.
And this ghost sort of like makes an effort to molest all three of them individually.
Mm.
And uh, they all have this sort of like experience of being the object of a sexual assault,
Yeah.
and then they work together to sort of like respond. And so they really sort of like lean on one another, sort of like
Mm.
affirm their I'll call it sisterhood, and work together to sort of bind up that ghost and rebuff him, rob him of his power,
Mm.
and send him off of this plane of existence.
And
And
it's
so,
empowering for them. It's described as kind of a healing experience, and it reminds me of how often a therapist in a consultation or something, we present that you have to validate the emotional reality before the person has insight. A ton of
yeah.
people come in and they're describing things where they feel they were the victim, and that they weren't, that they probably, their behavior was not okay, or whatever. But if you don't have empathy and say, yeah, you felt this way in that moment, and this was hard, and you don't want to say you have a right to bad behavior because you're a victim ever. But you do want to say, like, yes, your emotion is valid, and like, you are hurt, and that was your perspective at that time. And that line's great. It's hard. How do that's a big conversation of how much do you be validating before that becomes enabling. I draw that at the prescription. I don't ever want to say that I believe something that I don't believe, and I never want to say you should do this thing because it feels good when it isn't healthy.
Mhm.
I don't ever want to do that. But you want to be able to hold the emotional experience of the person as much as you can. And that's
Yeah,
kind of what devolves kind of naturally in some of these communities that you're observing.
yeah, absolutely. And what really struck me about that particular experience was that, they it was just sort of like a very clean, it wasn't messy at all. Right? Like here the abuser, you know, had no friends, had no pull with the legal system, was not going to, uh, turn around and accuse them of, lying about their assaults. He was just like sort of like a flat out evil um, entity,
Yeah.
let's say. And they were able to, sort of like be judge, jury, and executioner and exert complete power over him and send him off. And that is in such contrast to, how they might be forced to navigate that sort of a situation or those feelings in the real world.
Yeah.
Uh, and and I'll also say, like, I don't know enough about the personal histories of the three women to say whether they would consider themselves to be victims of sexual assault themselves. But
Sure, and
uh,
some people don't until they've healed. It's part of the
yeah,
process. They're not gonna, a lot of people I work with have real extreme, kind of violent political beliefs one way or the other. And once therapy's done, they're like, oh, I don't believe that anymore. And I don't know that because we didn't talk about it, but I'm glad that they don't have that anymore. But
that's right.
like it's the healing that makes the insight happen. And
Yeah,
like
yeah.
trauma patients, anyone with trauma, like a lot of times we revisit the same experience to try and have control over it in this kind of unconscious way of trying to heal. And if somebody has experienced sexual assault or something, I mean, as a therapist, I would so much rather them go to a seance or, a group that is going to help them, hold each other emotionally, whatever that means, than like, engage in hypersexuality to try and prove that, or dangerous situations with
Mm,
strangers to try and prove that they can go in and remaster that. I mean, that, one of those is preferable to me. I mean, not that there's not an abusive element sometimes in some spiritual groups. I mean, any group can have that, but the risk looks a whole lot less than getting on Grinder or something.
absolutely.
Well, I think, I mean, one of the things that has come up with me sometimes when somebody has like a fixation on religion, or like, I have to know this and I don't know, I want certainty here. I mean, I'll just kind of back up and talk about the limits of knowledge, like, the
Hmm.
universe is this thing that we say is expanding, but what we really mean is that the amount of space we can measure on the inside is getting more, and that there's this relationship between time, temperature, and speed and all space, and we can see this ball of rules, and from the inside it looks like there's more of it, but we have no idea what's on the outside. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm a therapist, not a priest. And um we talk, like, I talk to my daughter a lot. We read mythology and kind of world religions and different things. She's interested in
Hmm.
that right now. And um
How old is she, if you don't
she's
mind me?
7. So we go to
Oh,
some,
great.
Episcopal church services or different things, and she'll ask me, what things are true and how are they true. So the nature of all that is kind of interesting, and I want to be respectful of her development and kind of leave room for her to have agency and curiosity there. And one of the things she said to me, we like read or tell stories at night, and we were in the hammock, and she was like asking, like, yeah, but how did it get here? The question of all the way back to the kind of the Big Bang. And I was like, well, in the beginning it was just this tiny white dot of light and heat, and everything was together, and we can't really see past that moment. So all of our science is
Right.
just taking us back to that moment, but we don't really know why it's there. We don't really know. We can't see past that, through objectivity. And she was like, do you
Yeah.
think that's like God? And I was like, yeah, that, like, I think that that is kind of the mystery. And she was like, I kind of like that we can't know that more than that.
Hmm.
And I thought that was such a pretty way to kind of
Yeah.
approach
Very
this thing.
wise.
Yeah, yeah. My kids are really weird. Um, spend the day in the woods sword fighting with them, so we're we're just getting back. But yeah, I mean, a lot of those things about just kind of the limits of knowledge, and where we should maybe just have more humility are kind of an interesting place. But you never make a case that, like, well, who knows, and everyone's entitled to their own perspective. I mean, what I like about your writing is that um, you don't ever enable, and you don't ever just kind of duck a hard question through being avoidant. You say these things are bad. We know they're bad. I'm not going to reconsider these things. But also, like, maybe we don't know as much as we think we do, or we don't know everything yet. And I wonder, if you could talk about some of your conclusions at the end of the book, the flock of dodo stuff, and the idea that science maybe needs to change or get bigger. I was thinking of Theodore Porter when I was reading that section of your writing.
Yeah, yeah. I essentially, like, I sort of landed on this idea that scientists have lost control of their messaging, right? they can produce the most objective science that we've ever had, um, uh, thanks to sort of like the buffers between them and their funding sources, right? Where the public taxpayer is funding a lot of research, but they're sort of isolated from how the members of the public think, right? So they're able to. It's not like they're dependent on a wealthy patron and have to
Mhm.
worry about their analyses of pleasing that patron. So in that sense,
Science
it's
for
sort of like
tips
a
is kind of
golden
a scary
age.
model.
Right?
You
Science for
should bring back
tips.
like John Dee scrying for angles in the Queen's Court and then like losing favor.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and so, uh, but that disconnect sort of has its own penalty with it, as so many advantages do. Like they can do very objective science, but their disconnect from the public also means that the public doesn't necessarily understand or trust or value that science, right? And so um, that's bad, right? We want a public that will sort of like have some buy-in into the advances that science gives us. Maybe not like the squishy physics stuff of what happens when a quark goes out and we're all just a reflection of what's happening in a black hole somewhere. Like that, have at it, public. But when it comes to sort of like the values of medicine or you know, how can we build the best bridge, or how can we sort of like best measure um the impacts of a bad water system, or how can we contain a virus, or some sexually transmitted disease best. Like these are questions that science sets themselves to, that
Hmm.
public ought to be really listening to, right? Because
Hmm.
they have very practical impacts and benefits and disadvantages for our world. And so science needs to sort of like rethink how they message, right? They don't just need the science arm, they need sort of like a messaging arm that will help to communicate their results. And part of that comes when scientists are sort of like undergoing their own gut check, and sort of like not just papering over their sort of like elitist views, but truly coming to terms with those elitist views, right?
Yeah.
And truly speaking from more of a place of humility and transparency. Everyone agrees that publicly funded science should be transparent, but part of transparency is sort of like acknowledging those doubts and acknowledging that humility. And to be fair to the scientists, like oftentimes a scientist will sort of like make a statement that is couched in 4 or 5 qualifiers. Like, if this is
Yeah.
correct, and that bears further study, then there might be life on this other planet, right? K2, whatever that
But the
has been
news
making
needs
the
a
news.
5-second soundbite of life on other planet.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. And so there is sort of like this. And if the news didn't do it, then partisan groups or special interest groups would control that messaging, and oftentimes do control that messaging in ways that advantage their personal agendas. Um, and so that bridge needs to be built out much, much better. I do sort of like suggest in one section of the book, that if scientists could sort of like re-instill a sense of wonder in and awe in some of the ways that they disseminate their findings. For
Mhm.
example, about sort of like what happens to the energy of a human being after that human dies,
Mhm.
right? There's a lot of spiritual answers for that, but biology hasn't really like put out
Yeah.
its own sort of like message, which can be quite beautiful, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so
Well, where a lot
that
of the biggest scientists did. I mean, have you read that letter that Einstein wrote to the death of, I forget the name, but he had a colleague that died and he wrote a letter to the wife. And
no,
he said, somebody who knows as much about quantum physics as me and your husband believe in the inevitability of all things to like conjoin through time or something. I don't remember, but it's very poetic. And I mean, the
Wow.
sense of humility in some of the smartest scientists out there. I mean, in my mind, they're not the problem. Like, I've never met the people that are the huge innovators, and I talk to a lot of people on the phone that aren't on the podcast, and I like network with a lot of people, and like I'm always struck by the humility under the creativity and the powerful intuition of some of the best minds of our time. You know,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. Yeah. Like when they're shooting for that level, they can be really brass knuckles,
yeah,
overachievers. But when they get that level, it's almost like their whole being can just like relax and sort of like uh, uh, use the use that lofty perch to gain such wisdom and insight and sort of like um I guess comfort in who they themselves are. I
yeah.
think that really helps them to sort of achieve that.
Well, I think that the worst ones are the worst people that are doing kind of politics or science that kind of discredit the things that it's like, like I like. We have the same goal, but I think that what they're doing actually makes it worse. Are the ones that are almost like hall monitors, where they're like, I have to set a good example for you because I'm better than you and you don't know all the information. And so, because I mean, like half of the conversations I've had with a colleague or somebody where I just feel like what they're doing is deeply ineffective, either for political advocacy or for kind of scientific advocacy. When I say, like,
Mhm.
hey, look, I mean, like, you're saying these things, and that's a really kind of condescending simplification. What I get 99% of the time is them being like, "Oh, well, you and I know that." But and when you have that attitude in advocacy, I think you get a hardcore, usually very right-wing reaction to you that is totally justifiable because it's annoying. Like, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
smug, you know, and it's like the
Absolutely.
enlightened atheist thing in like the early 2000s of like, I am, anytime anybody's up there talking about like, oh, I'm a logical being that only is affected by logic, you're just not aware of your emotional experience, and it's in control of you and subverting your intention, a lot of the time.
Yeah. It's like the best thing about the social justice movement is that it wants to bring about like social justice. But the worst thing about the social justice movement is that it sort of plays into this human tendency to feel holier than thou about
Yeah.
somebody else. Oh, you said that, that thing that I wouldn't say, and let's talk about that for an hour, right?
Yeah.
And that is so counterproductive and unhelpful and isolating
Well,
for
just the question, like,
um
who is this helping will trigger so many leftist groups where you're like, okay, you've got, you doing a 30-minute land acknowledgement, you know, you know, is
yeah,
this something that is more for you or more for the cause? And I think that a lot of people that are aesthetically left, but maybe more liberal and reactionary at heart, what they're doing is they're talking about the population that they want to help. And you see this in science too. I'm not trying to change the topic, but like they're talking about the population they want to help, like they're this victim that whatever. But really, you're talking about you, and you haven't done your work to realize that you're just trying to kind of get validation. I don't know if that makes sense.
oh, interesting.
You're kind of mistaking the
Yeah,
victim for yourself. And that's when you come in and you're like, okay, effectively, how do we help this population? And like, as a social worker, like, what can we do? And like, we can give them these choices and these outcomes. The person who says, no, 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 nothing that this group of people does is their fault at all. They're talking about themselves. They don't want consequences for them. That's the kind of victimhood leftism that's not helpful any more than the projected, I'm going to identify with the abuser all the time right wing thing, because a lot of right wing politics are also an emotional response where you have somebody
of
that says
course.
this group of people is gay or they're black or they're vulnerable. And you go, no, 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 that's the free market or that's God or whatever. Like that's God's, they don't have enough faith. That's just your emotional reality is looking for a logical explanation for the abuser is right in every situation because I'm like the abuser and
Right.
victimhood's not real. We're
I'm just
bombing
a truth
14
teller.
countries.
I'm a straight shooter.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Right?
mean, and so much of politics to me is just trauma, and a lot of that informs the way that we deal with science. I mean, you see those same fights in academia, which is why academia is kind of frustrating, I think.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and what one thing that I talk about in the book is sort of the difference between how practitioners treat um, people who have been possessed by jinn,
Mhm.
right?
Whose work
Jinn,
is that? What was the name? I'm blanking on the name.
I am not remembering her name fully either. But she was a PhD candidate at, I believe, UCal. And she sort of did this really interesting side by side comparison of people who have been possessed by a jinn and people who have been abducted by aliens,
Mhm.
and how in the Muslim world, people who have been possessed by jinn, which is a very pervasive, widespread belief, have a therapeutic, clinic-based outlet for that belief. Right,
Mhm.
when they go to see their clinical therapist, who's fully trained in all the medical stuff, and they say, "I'm having this problem," one of the tools in that clinical practitioner's toolbox is sort of like to create a therapy that speaks in the language of jinn possession,
Yeah.
where a holy man can be brought in, and they write some special words from the Quran onto some paper that can be dissolved in water and drunk by the afflicted. And that is proven to be like a very practical and effective treatment. And it sort of like Trojan horses some treatment practices that are recognized by Western science in terms of like, peer support and frequent check-ins and that sort of thing. But it also has its own sort of like spin, and it just sort of comes from this other place.
Mhm.
Um, Whereas alien abductees, they don't get the sort of like mantle of cultural sensitivity, right?
Mhm.
If an alien abductee walks into a clinical office in any country in the world and says, "Hey, I've been abducted by aliens, and I'm really afraid because I worry it's going to happen again." Um, there is sort of like there's no treatment for that other
Yeah.
than this sort of like tacit, well, I'm not going to challenge your delusion, but that's
Well,
what
I
you're having
mean,
is a
I
delusion,
think
right?
effectively, psychology should say, "What symptoms is that causing?" "Well, I'm anxious, I'm scared, I'm not eating, I'm not sleeping." "Okay, let's deal with the emotion, let's go through that." I mean, what the person
Yeah,
is saying happened, why fight about that at all? I don't see the point, you know? Maybe
right.
they're just maybe it's real and the alien might come back and you still gotta work with anxiety. Maybe it's not real and the person has, made this metaphor that's more acceptable to their conscious mind for sexual abuse or something. And it's easier to feel like I was taken to another planet and experimented on than granddad touched me in the woodshed. And
Hmm.
your therapy, I mean, how does it change? I mean, the insight's going to come back when the patient has capacity for it, when the emotion is cooled down, when the trauma response is not as much, when you've recognized that emotion and the window of tolerance has gotten more. So, I mean, why even sit there and say, okay, what date? I don't understand why a lot of people need to kind of figure out what exactly happened. You're not a detective, you're doing psychology.
I think part of the root of it is that scientists and scientifically trained, evidence-driven practitioners don't want to put the wind beneath the wings of beliefs that they think are patently false, right? So, like, if I start talking to you about the aliens, then I'm sort of like endorsing this idea of aliens that I do not think is true. I think that that's sort of like the driving underlying motivation behind the reasons that scientists and those in healthcare and mental health fields in particular uh, cause them to just sort of like dismiss or reject those things to debunk them. And I think they think like, oh, we don't want to legitimize those beliefs and give them more power. But
Well,
I
I don't
think
know why
in
you would need to legitimize it. I mean, I have to follow evidence-based practice. I have a board. I'm licensed. I have to justify any clinical intervention I do, and I don't sit there and say, "Yeah, I think the alien's real and this is what's happening," any more than I would say, sit there and focus on if the person's bringing in a traumatic incident that's more plausible. I mean, I wouldn't sit there and be like, yeah, the point of the treatment is to say, how's this affecting you and how can you get better and how can you change? So, I mean, when I'm saying that you take it seriously, but not literally, I don't mean that you validate anything that is unhealthy. I just mean that there's not really a fight that I see you have to have from a therapy perspective.
It's probably a level of nuance that's way above my pay grade because I'm not a therapist, but I would imagine that some practitioners would feel that if they're not directly challenging it, then they are leaving the door open for that person to go home to their family, and their concerned family member says, well, did the therapist tell you that you were wrong and that there's not a goblin under your bed? And have the patient say, no, he actually he thinks that he agrees that it's there, but we're dealing with it. Like that's not the answer maybe that some concerned people
Yeah.
would be looking for, as off base as that might be.
I've had patients
um
that came in and felt like they were being gang stalked, or that, and sometimes medication, dopamine disorders need medication. I make everybody mad with my perspective on the podcast because people are like, you should say that crystals heal you without, and I throw your antidepressant or throw your antipsychotic in the toilet. And I'm like, no, I don't think that. And then there's other people that are like, well, you're a crank and a pseudoscientist because you're open to, something that I'm not. And, so I kind of get it from both sides. But, none of those patients, I didn't, endorse the thing that they were doing that was not going to have a good result for them. I told them what the result of that is. If you tell people about this thing, they're probably going to have this reaction because this isn't a common experience that a lot of people don't, think about this. So if you
mhm.
keep doing it, you're probably going to get that reaction. But, this is what I would do with those emotions. And we did brain spotting, we did somatic experiencing. Some of them did the QEEG brain mapping and neuromodulation. And most of those people at the end of it said, I realized that this was actually sexual abuse. And I didn't
Well,
want to make that true because I thought I loved this person, or I wasn't allowed to have these thoughts about them. But I never got there with anyone, debating them and telling them, "I will not endorse your belief because your belief is not." I just didn't do that. Yeah, I don't think that's effective. I think that's a way that you make those people feel more alone and get them to leave. But I don't enable people. I mean, I'm the joke with my friends is I'm like the antisocial worker. Like I'm not. I'll tell you what I think, and I'm not going to lie to patients. I'm not going to lie, to anybody really.
and
Um,
those are really powerful results. So yeah, I think you're maybe unusual in your ability to sort of like hold respect for without explicitly endorsing. I think there are a lot of people who cannot navigate that quite as deftly as you can.
Well, I think that's sad. I think that's something that the industry should aspire to make more common, and not to be like me.
Yeah.
But I don't have the
Well,
answer for you, and I don't do all kinds of therapy, but to find ways to open the door to real people, and not what
and
you.
if they are motivated by sort of like a desire to not endorse and legitimize the what they think of as sort of wackadoo beliefs. um my concern is that they are themselves becoming delegitimized by their refusal to sort of accommodate those sorts of beliefs. Like when you have large members of the public who are turning to, ghost hunters and mediums and psychics and alien peer support groups to explain the world to them.
Mhm.
Uh, People who are, nothing against those people who identify in those fields, but they are not. There's no training. I can hang
Yeah.
out a ghost hunter shingle on my front door tomorrow, right,
Yeah.
and start accepting clients. And when they tell me that they're hearing voices or feeling uneasy, I can tell them whatever the heck I want to.
Mhm.
Right, and so that's sort of like the danger.
Yeah, there was a
But
place. I have a friend in Florence, Alabama, and he had a neighbor who seriously needed help, and she didn't have a lot of money and whatever. And there was a very predatory organization. Like every time she was trying to save this money, and this van would pull up that looked like the Scooby Doo Mystery Machine. I don't remember the name of the company, but it had some, ghost stoppers or whatever. And these people would go in with gas and stuff, and she was trying to feed her kids, and they had all these doodads, and it was just clearly not what she needed. It wasn't that the house was not the problem. The environment was not the
right,
problem. It was something on the inside that needed to be witnessed.
oh, that's
So I mean, that
heartbreaking.
stuff is abusive. I mean, I don't think that I'm not endorsing, exploiting anybody. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And so I think like if the and yet people are that customers, that victim was more comfortable calling those ghost hunters
Yeah.
in the Scooby-Doo van than she was, calling a legit practitioner.
But if
And
the industry
so,
was more open, if there was more of a language to accept that, I don't know that the business model of the, $2,000 a visit ghost hunter would be there,
yeah. You can sort of like attack that on two fronts, right? One, you can require evidence-based folks to be more open and inclusive and have a welcoming environment for people who are in those worlds. And two, you can sort of like create a class of, let's say, ghost hunters who are licensed and who are trained, maybe not in
We're
every
not in
nuance
it for
of what a ghost
$2,000
is.
an hour from people on, welfare, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
that are in
Yeah.
it because they want to look for ghosts and, and
Yeah.
better reasons.
And people who are trained to sort of like mitigate the harmful effects that they might otherwise be prone to. So like if the person describes hearing voices in their head, a licensed ghost hunter might say, all right, I'm going to look for demons, but let's also connect you with this therapist. But let's also, sort of like the complementary medicine approach.
Mhm.
And there's I think I said this in the quack book, like there's this, in some states there are like state boards of homeopathy, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I do not believe in homeopathy at all. It's got some very odd ideas at its heart that don't pass a smell test. But a lot of people believe in homeopathy, and what these state boards do, like for example in the state of Nevada, is they ensure that a homeopathic practitioner who's treating a cancer patient isn't telling that cancer patient to stay away from the doctor, and they're
Yeah.
ensuring that their practitioners are not having sexual relationships with their clients or patients. So just sort of like maintaining a basis of ethics that
There's a
can.
licensed astrology body in Birmingham or Alabama. I know that because they have to refer to us. They're more comfortable with our therapy practice
Oh,
because they want to make sure that astrologers aren't saying, "I'm going to treat your borderline personality disorder with planet stuff." If somebody has
that's
a medical issue, so we'll get a call from some of them.
that's absolutely fantastic. And like, so what that does is that creates, like in Birmingham, there's a class of fortune tellers who have found a home in the system and therefore have a stake in keeping this whole institutional thing rolling, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
And
doctors of
those folks
if
can
you go
distinguish
back to those
themselves from.
medical boards of like when people were fighting about herbal medicine, when it was all, kind of whatever. I forget the name of the guy that wrote Dorfa, which is this really wild novel, and he has this huge library of like herbal medicine, and his organization is one that lost, even though it has some better organizations that came now. But like, I mean, we license doctors of osteopathy. Who believes in osteopathy? I mean, they're practicing medicine, and they have to just because of this weird licensure requirement. If you get a DO instead of an MD, you have to memorize certain movements that bones do that don't do anything, that don't heal you. I mean, like the school still has to do it because it's part of their credentialing, but like no one thinks osteopathy, and sorry to the one listener out there who will email me, but like generally, even the DOs that I've talked to, don't think that works. But that's baked
that's
into this institution, A lot of this
that's
stuff is,
wild.
have you ever looked at that? It's pretty weird.
No,
Yeah.
uh,
I mean,
there's a
that I know a
kind of
lot of DOs
inertia.
that are great doctors, but a lot of people have. I mean, because they practice medicine, they can do the same thing any MD can do. But there's just
There's just
there were.
this added
Well,
layer
I
of
mean, there were points in
nonsense.
American history where there were like 9 competing medical boards that all thought the other one was cranks, and for some reason, DO and MD are the ones that won. Why?
That's really, really funny.
Are you
Um,
you familiar with Joseph Campbell? I know you play D&D, so probably some overlap there. But
that sounds
Mono
familiar, but I can't.
He's
Who
like
is
the
he?
hero. Joseph Campbell was like the mythographer from the 70s that like inspired Star Wars and a bunch of that stuff with the hero's journey,
Oh,
that idea.
uh,
But like him and
yeah,
like
yeah,
John Dominic Crossan, well, Joseph Campbell has this quote about myths are private dreams, or yeah, or myths are public dreams, dreams are private myths. And John
yeah.
Dominic Crossan has like another line where he's talking about he's I think he is Catholic, but he deals with kind of the psychology of religion and how it represents these parts of self. And he has a thing where he's like, at the end of a talk, he'll stop and be like, I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that ancient people talked in metaphors and we're now smart enough to decode them. I'm saying that we are now stupid enough to take metaphors literally. Like, and I mean, you look at like ancient Greece, you know, Socrates gets executed saying that a ghost is talking to him. That is probably a metaphor for a point that he's making. You know, if you read
Yeah.
Socrates, like these things are kind of older. There's a lot of people that kind of go to the mat for subject of spaces being important with objective reality also. And I mean, that's such an old conversation. I don't know. I don't know if that is something that I'll hand that over to you. I don't know if any of that speaks to you or if that's just kind of out there and needs to get cut out.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think certainly like, I think what it speaks to me is that it just sort of like reinforces this idea that like, while I, again, am an objective numbers sciencey guy, I'm far more a member of the skeptic community than in any sort of believer community can recognize, even I can recognize that people sort of like aren't built to just believe in objective science, right? People are built to believe in those myths and to believe in those dreams and to have those narratives that are hugely important to them, right? Much more important that how many examples are there of the public doing something that is self-defeating because it serves sort of like a narrative, right?
Yeah.
And institutions have to learn how to sort of like tickle that part of the brain, and they have to learn how to accommodate those sorts of worldviews, or the institutions themselves will become obsolete.
Yeah.
History is littered with uh, institutions that have become obsolescent and have winked out of existence. And our current institutions, we're sort of like in the bubble, right? We can't imagine a place without, big hospitals and government and a massive church and all of this stuff. But right outside that bubble, there are times in human history and perhaps times in human future that are not sort of dominated by those centralized institutional power structures. And I think that that's a really frightening idea on some level, but it's also sort of like an opportunity on
Yeah.
some level. And um, if institutions want to change that, they have to serve the people better. They have to share those dreams with the populations that they serve and find that sort of like common ground. Um, and they need to, you know, find a closer space with the public. They just
Mhm.
need to hold more respect. And
And I would say
if
that
they,
that
yeah,
comes from giving the public more information, not being afraid of, well, the bigger the research study, the bigger the audience is the press. And so I'm going to try and withhold information or put up walls or condescend. I think that when you do that,
yeah,
you're really fueling right wing extremism in a scary way. We saw some of that during COVID, where people are saying, well, the public's not ready to know this information. They'll get too confused. And it fueled conspiracy theories. If they had just said, yeah, there are some the problems with this, or, right now there's a shortage of masks, so please leave them for healthcare workers, then I think when
right,
they switched over to now everyone has to wear a mask, people would have felt more empowered, felt more informed and a part of the process. And I just watched that be so mishandled. And,
yes.
and things, I don't know. I mean, that is that kind of what you're saying, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. Like, I find the lapses of transparency to be um, sort of less prevalent, I suppose. We see them when there's a lot of heat and pressure on an issue. So maybe in that point, to that point, like they're choosing the most damaging times to be less than transparent, right? Uh,
Yeah, I think
yeah,
if you
they're,
treat people like they're stupid, they will act like they're stupid,
yeah,
And if
right,
you treat
right.
people with respect, they will be more likely to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely believe that. And and yeah, there is that sense that like um you can't give the American public a hard truth and everybody in government sort of like bending over backwards to do that. You mentioned how like on the left they were withholding certain pieces of information, or the government was from this sort
Yeah.
of like protectionist place. But Trump was sort of doing the opposite, where he was saying like, "Oh yeah, there's no COVID, everything is fine."
Yeah.
And when
Well, I don't think
Woodward asked him
that's just
why that was, he was
misinformation.
like, "Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
just wrong.
but
I don't mean that isn't what I
but it
mean when I
came
say
from
you
the
give
same
them more
place."
information. Yeah.
But it was that same sort of like protectionist idea of like, well, I don't want people to worry.
They're
That's
both
what Trump
avoidant.
told
They're both
Bob
avoidant
Woodward.
about a problem, and avoidance is
Yeah,
a
yeah,
route to very bad stuff, I think.
yeah, yeah. And so I do think transparency is an issue, but I think it's probably not the greatest issue from my perspective. I think from my perspective, we need more deliverable outcomes from government.
Mhm.
We need folks to feel like they are in a stable country
Yeah.
and a stable world. What one of the you probably knew about this before I wrote about it, but there was a anthropologist who went to the South Pacific Islands around 1900 and sort of documented the different fishing techniques of some indigenous folks who lived in sort of like an island system. And when they wanted to catch fish from the coral reefs, they would sort of like mash up a poisonous root and stick it on a stick and go out and throw a net over a coral reef. Stick in the stick, the poison would come out of the root, the fish would flounder into the net, and they would go home with dinner. And that was a very stable way to get food, and it had no sort of like superstitious behaviors attached to it.
Mhm.
They did the thing because they knew the thing worked, and they knew that that would get them the calories and food they needed to see the next day. When those same folks went shark fishing, um, it was a dramatically different experience in terms of supernatural beliefs. There was a magic man of the village who instituted all sorts of taboos on whether you couldn't sing, you couldn't have sex, you couldn't whistle, you had to wear certain clothing. And then when it was shark hunting day,
Would you
the
normally
magic
have
man.
sex while you were shark hunting? Like, does that need to be
Well, like
prohibited?
I'm talking about, like,
Okay.
good question, Joel. I'm glad you raised that,
Yeah.
Joel. No, the answer is no. This is
Yeah.
like the 2 months leading
I
up to shark hunting season.
yeah,
They're like
I
they're
don't
building the
mean to
boat.
presume, how you hunt sharks, or kink shame.
You've been doing it all wrong.
Yeah.
Now, when I hunt a shark, it's pretty steamy. Yeah, no, yeah,
Jaws
but they
5.
go out in these. Oh my god. Uh, they go out in these boats on the open ocean in a dangerous spot, weather-wise, and they have these sort of like sticks with shells strung along the sticks, and they shake those sticks underwater, and it mimics the sound of a shoal of fish jumping in and out of the water. And then when the shark comes to that sound, they bash in the shark's head with like a piece of like stove wood, essentially.
Hmm.
And that is not at all a sure thing, right? That's a very chaotic
Mhm.
endeavor without a lot of hope of success. And because it's such a sort of like chaotic, uncertain area of their lives, they attach all sorts of superstitions because they didn't have any other sort of way to have the confidence of control
Mhm.
that they had when they were fishing in the coral reefs. And so when a society is more chaotic, when we feel like we have less control over our lives, you know, certainly we're going to be more prone to turning to supernatural explanations for things. Maybe we can compartmentalize where we can, ask an astrologer about how to cope with grief, but we can still ask an accountant to do our finances. But maybe we can't. Maybe we're just a couple generations away from asking our astrologer to do our finances.
Well, I think a lot of when I was saying that, I think we're approaching something with institutional decline that looks kind of like the 70s, is like anytime an empire's star is waning, you see a rise in a belief in magic. And that's why I get so frustrated with people where I'm like, even if you believe this, you want the same political outcome I want. If you press this button, it does this. Like it does. And like when you look at, because, and it makes sense because like when Edward Edinger has like a cool diagram, an ego and archetype, where he's talking about the thing where the institution is containing the archetypes versus where the unconscious is speaking directly to people, and the intuition looks a lot like, schizophrenia. But there's like this, you go back to like Rome, and when the Gaul is getting paraded through the streets with elephants, and they're like, the empire reflects your ego, your personal power is the nation or the religious cult is an extension of your personal power, so you have power and certainty. People feel okay. Or okay, well, the empire's not doing so hot, but we're going to pay for these gladiatory games. Go watch football, and your team's going to win, and you're going to get, it's a reflection of my ego. When you say all the political options are bad, you're not going to get what you want. Yeah, you can go vote, but it's the ending of Mass Effect 3. Then what happens is people go inward to find a source of certainty, and sometimes with interesting results. I mean, I don't think that process is entirely bad, but like, yeah, when you say left or right, whatever you want, the political options are terrible, and you're not going to get what you want, and the empire doesn't do anything that you want. And we have these huge group of issues that are bipartisan that everyone wants, and neither political party will touch them. What you get is 60% of your population believing in magic every time. That's why Mithraic cults exploded in Rome. Like, if you do that, that's what you get. And there's people that want to be like, well, I go on to Wikipedia and I cite my sources, and I have a thing where you can check the meme for accuracy. It doesn't matter. If you continue to have a political stagnation like we're doing, what you get is this, and you could say you don't like that, but not accepting that is just a refusal to accept the way the world works on its own terms. This pretend.
It's absolutely true. And whether we chalk that instability up to, hyperpartisanship or late stage capitalism, or just sort of like societal decay or the internet, or whatever it is, you're absolutely right that it seems inevitable that these beliefs are going to be spiking around now. And it's really, really important that we figure out ways to cope with and overcome that, and still have faith in one another and in our collective actions. Because that's really what's sort of like at stake here, is the belief in a shared reality.
Yeah.
Right. Paranormal beliefs that prize the individual experience over a shared reality, whether that shared reality is, the dogma of a church, or the outcome of a scientific study, the facts. Then you really have a radically different society that may not be able to take care of its people in the same way that we have right now. And if that's the way we're going, we gotta bridge that gap and make sure that that's a positive change in society, and not just a sort of like degradation and collapse like has happened in the past, as you point out to.
Well, I mean, I think both political parties don't really want to do the things that, I mean, to a certain extent, some elements I think in the Republicans do it. Like a lot of the Democrats, people are like, we've seen you get elected, we've seen you have a supermajority, we've seen you control all three branches of government, and then you were like, oh well, somehow Mitch McConnell's stopping me. I don't know. I have to wait till 100% of everyone agrees with me to do anything. And when you do that, people quit believing you, and when people can see not even the weird coincidences and deep esoteric whatever. I mean, when people can just see, okay, the Panama paper things happen and the official story does not make sense. The people you're punishing are not even the one when the Epstein thing happens. I mean, you're those, and no one will touch these things, when just every 15 years we say, oh, oops, the CIA did something really bad, but no one was punished, and we promise we won't do it again, but no one was held accountable, and we'll do this 12 years later. Since when you continue to do that, what do you expect to happen? And when you have neither political party will do anything, I think that, and I'm not trying to make a political point here, I'm just trying to make a psychology one, that like you're feeding all of these things that are ripping these institutions down that you claim to love based on your own avoidance of those issues and those hard problems. And I think that you look
Yeah.
at that really honestly at the end of the
Yeah.
coastline.
Yeah. It seems like that we've cut out so many exceptions to transparency, in the name of national security, or the name of sort of like shielding medical practitioners from consequences,
Yeah.
and all that sort of thing. Like, you know, those are good goals, I suppose, to maintain national security
Mhm.
and to allow a practitioner
Did it
to.
work? Is the world better? I
Right,
mean,
right.
Noam Chomsky's got a pretty good line in the end of one of his books about, like, if you look at the war in Iraq and you look at everything that we did after 9/11, assume we did nothing and we took this money and we spent it on anything else.
Yeah,
Lighting it on fire may have been better than what we did.
yeah, yeah,
Look at the
yeah.
effects
Right.
we're dealing with now and will be over the next 25 years from that
Exactly right.
foreign
Yeah.
policy experiment. But, there's no accountability. John Bolton is back in the White House for a minute until, someone else is. It's like, why can we take some of that hyper logic and objectivity that we claim to do and maybe look at people who have been wrong about foreign policy every time they've opened their mouth for 80 years and get them out of the Senate? Can we do that?
Right, right, right. Absolutely.
And we
And
defend them
and
because there's no one else until they're so old they have dementia, and so it's mean to criticize them, but they still have to be wielding the keys to nuclear missiles. I mean, like, what is that system? And how do you expect anybody to go into a hospital and be like, "Yeah, this makes sense. I believe in
yeah.
authority and stuff." Like,
It's money in politics, it's special interests, it's yeah, it's and one of the things that's so frustrating about it is that every time there's sort of like a surge of, what I'll call progressivism, but because I am a progressive, um, is, every advancement of worker rights, say, is sort of like grappled with by the capitalistic powers that be, and they just evolve new systems. And so every time there's an advance, we make the system tougher and the game gets harder to beat. And it takes so much collective action to achieve anything for members of the public. And the power structure just sort of like adapts and evolves. Were you a comic book fan? You a
I've
comic
read
book kid?
some. Yeah.
All right. I was really into like the Marvel comics for a while when I was a teen, and there was like this group called the West Coast Avengers. They had Hawkeye and some of the others, and they got into this like fight against this like robot creature or whatever, and they would go out and the individuals on the team would defeat it, but every time it got defeated, it just sort of like reprogrammed to sort of like accommodate that flaw that had led to that loss. And that's sort of like what the capitalistic powers are that run the world. And it's really dispiriting. And it really does feel like they're being very well served by the current chaos.
They're kind of immune to
Uh
protest at this point. I mean, protests were a scary thing in the 70s. I don't know that they are anymore, you know?
yeah, yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
The public
There's
reaction is just kind of built into the system and the mathematics to be accounted for in a way where it changes, it, take the option for change is taken away from you, which is, what we're talking about feeds a lot of these problems. People feel that whether or not they
yeah,
consciously are aware of it, they feel it and that energy goes somewhere.
they're just so insulated. And Starbucks puts a lot more thought into what symbols they're going to put on their coffee cup than they do on whether or not they have to pay anyone a fair wage,
Yeah.
because the coffee cup symbology will motivate people, and the fair wage will not. You'll not see people turning out on the streets in anger over the fact that workers aren't getting paid a livable wage, say. And not to pick on Starbucks specifically, but choose your company.
Well, I think what you're talking about at the end, what you're implying, I think, is incentive structures. I mean, people want to like
Mhm.
cancel this or get mad at one company. I mean, I remember there was like a huge thing where people were angry with Walmart for doing something, and I was like, was the thing legal? they're like, yeah, but stop Walmart. And I was like, yeah, maybe you put enough pressure on Walmart to do it a different way, but everyone else will make it illegal if you don't want them to do it. I mean, there's a whole thing where people are like, oh, Subway puts a chemical that is used to make yoga mats in the bread. And in Europe, you can't even feed this to mice in a lab, but we feed it to, kids here. And so Subway's bad. And it's like, is it legal to put that chemical in food? Why? If the incentive structure allows it and incentivizes you to do it, most people will do it. But we want to make personal accountability work like for corporations or something in this weird way where it's like, you can't cancel Halliburton in the same way you can cancel Neil Gaiman. You have to say,
that's right.
How can we go out and do this? Speaking of comic books, yeah, Neil Gaiman won't be writing anymore.
Yeah.
I think that so much of the stuff that you say is really interesting. You also speak truth to power in one important point. Circus peanuts are terrible. I don't think since Banana Ruts there's been a worse candy.
Who is buying them? Who is making them? Talk about things that ought to be illegal.
Yeah, they're always in the bag where if you buy 2, you get it for like 9 cents cheaper or something. Gas station.
Yeah, I'd like 1 circus peanut, please. Okay, but for $4 less, you can have all of these circus peanuts. You can have a vat of them. Okay, I guess I gotta buy the vat.
Yeah, we'll give people a little sample too, because there's one place where you mentioned me in the book, which I appreciate. So just go ahead and get to that. Here we go.
Please do.
This is not my voice. This is Matt's voice. It's read in his voice. My investigation led me to Alabama, where I met a shoeless dullard of a social worker, shirtless but in grubby barbecue grease smeared overalls. His dull, sad eyes peered out beneath the brim of a loosely woven straw hat. His reptile-like tongue licked gnats, and beads of perspiration from his patchy mustache, delicately savoring each indiscriminately as if they were the sweetest ambrosia. So that's beautiful prose. I mean, that's like looking into a mirror. I don't know.
Thank you. That was actually the first draft. I'm so surprised that made print.
So that is not where actually Matt's writing.
That's awesome.
If you want to read it, you should buy the book on Amazon. Is there a place where people can buy it that is more beneficial to you?
No, I do get asked that, and I always appreciate the question, but the answer is just no. If get it from your library. I don't care. What is good for me is people reading it and liking it and talking about it to friends and family, and sort of like building that culture of appreciation for it. And that is money in my pocket at the end of the day. And it also makes me feel very good. So if you have, $30, go buy the hardcover. If you don't, get it from the library. Go steal it out of Joel's office.
Because you had what 2-3 copies of If It Walks Like a Quack disappeared from the waiting room. I love the idea of like a bit about somebody that's obsessed with evidence-based practice in medicine and also a thief. And Matt's first 2 books, Libertarian Walks Into a Bear. I mean, there's a great, if you want a sample of that one, there's a great write-up in I think the Atlantic or something. What is it?
It is the New Republic.
The New Republic.
Yeah.
That's a great preview of that one. It's a great book. And Walks Like a Quack is a really interesting kind of walk through the scientific method and the ways that people grift in healthcare. And this one's fantastic. I think Ghost Lab is my favorite. And there's a lot of places where you just let this stuff be as funny as it is, with in a loving way. And it's really sweet. It's touching, and it delves into all of these questions about our society. It's beautiful.
If nothing else, you learn so much about sort of like the inner workings of a paranormal themed organization. Everything from like a psychomantium to a psychic fair to a ghost hunt. There's just all sorts of interesting settings and devices in the narrative that lend themselves to a really fun experience, I think, in the reading. So thank you, Joel, so much for saying such kind things about the book. I'm really looking forward to being able to see more people read it and hopefully share your enjoyment of it.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. I want to be respectful of your time. If there's anything that, because I know you're an hour ahead of me, so it's probably late there. And but if there's anything that you want to talk about or things we can do, I was trying to structure the conversation so there were certain clips I could cut around to get the sciencey crowd, and then a funny joke for my Instagram, and like different things together. But if there's anything you want to go on about, I'm happy to continue, and then I can put that in, earlier in the interview,
Yeah,
or anything.
let me think for just a second if I want to take advantage of that. It is getting pretty late here, but
I'm sorry that our
no,
schedule.
no, no, no. It's not on you
Yeah.
at all.
I'm looking at everything left on my like notes from the book, and
Mhm.
they're either pretty abstract or they're like jokes about Echo the Dolphin being like RFK's dreams and things like that. So,
Well, yeah, I guess I think the one thing that I'll say is that I do think our current environment of institutional distrust and sort of like anti-institutionalism is maybe the most pressing political issue of our time.
yeah.
It is at the root of everything that's wrong with America and all of our institutions and talking heads that are trying to address the idea of institutional distrust by debunking conspiracy theories and talking about science literacy and all that. They're all completely off base.
Mhm.
Um, they're they've identified the problem, but they haven't identified the solution.
Yeah.
And I think that folks who read the book will get a different perspective into um, how you can thwart a conspiracy theory by understanding the conspiracy theorists behind it. And
And I would
you
say the
can,
emotion under the
yeah,
conspiracy theory and the material need that is fueling that emotion. If you provide healthcare, if you provide these things, what you're going to get what you say you want. So let's go ahead and separate the people who say they want it and the people who actually want it. Politically.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, and how we can sort of like, co-opt might be too strong a word, but how you can harness the energy behind this very vibrant culture that encompasses a large swath of America,
Hmm.
and have that work for the public good instead of its current harmful expressions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time. It's wonderful to speak with you.
Oh, love, don't leave me by myself, or I'm bound to lose my meaning. We'll start a little family and call it our religion. Hunt for ghosts inside our hearts, 'cause we'll never give up wishing that we live on, babe, we live on in our song.